Well, I got to tell you, so I used to be in business. I've been associated with startup companies. And in many respects, it is the regulatory burden that is a higher burden than even the tax burden to entrepreneurship and launching new enterprises. And it is just crushing. And so what this means is you get, big businesses can handle this. Small businesses can't. And for example, I spoke earlier about the Dodd-Frank Act, which was the single largest attack of government on finance, at least in my lifetime, and certainly since the New Deal. And so what we saw was the big banks got bigger and the small banks got fewer. And we had less of a democratization of capital, and the federal government became more entrenched. Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, by the way, one of the smartest guys I've met.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of American Potential. When should the government be able to take control of different aspects of Americans' lives? There seems to be a growing trend of this happening, often arguing that it's necessary for security, for safety, for economic reasons. Well, the problem with that is that it can lead to limiting individual freedoms and reduce the choices people can have. Now, when it comes to government regulations, those regulations can be a barrier to businesses, to the economy, and ultimately impacting Americans' wallets. We're going to talk about this issue with today's guest, who's a strong advocate for fiscal conservatism and limited government. During his time in Congress, he chaired the House Financial Services Committee, where he played a key role in shaping financial legislation and promoting free market policies. He was elected House Republican Conference Chairman in the 112th Congress, which is the fourth highest ranking position in the Republican leadership. Before being elected to Congress, he worked in the financial, energy, and legal sectors. I want to welcome former Congressman Jeb Hensarling to the show. All right, welcome to the show, Congressman. Thanks for being with us.
No, happy to be here.
Well, listen, before we get into the topics, you sit on the advisory board of Americans for Prosperity. What is it about AFP that you like?
Well, number one, our values clearly aligned, commitment to foundational principles of our republic. That's the most important thing. But I would say from the time, Jeff, that I was in public office, of all the groups that kind of are working in the conservative movement, I thought that AFP really had a broader vision, a long-term strategic plan. It is important. These battles come up every 2 years. But we have to look beyond a 2-year election cycle, which is one of the things AFP does. Second of all, when I was in office again, I just noticed that AFP probably had what I judged to be the first or second most effective ground game. I certainly think they're number one now. And I think that's indispensable. It's kind of like that last mile of wires that bring power to your home. I mean, AFP with their door-to-door work is really bringing that last mile of conservative power home. And they do it like no one else. And then last but not least, I would say that what helps make them effective is they're really selling a vision and they're selling principles and then the policies that flow from that. And so a lot of people who might have an aversion to, say, a specific label of the Republican Party, they first realize in coming into politics, wait a second, here are the principles I care about, and then later the candidate and the party follow. So, it's just indispensable to have a great ground game, strategic vision, really good marketing of foundational principles. You put it all together, I'm very happy and honored to be associated with AFP.
Well, and that's great. And we're very proud to have you as well on our advisory board. I will say, one of the great things that I've always enjoyed about AFP, and I've been with AFP for 14 years, is the fact that they help hold even Republicans accountable, right? It's not about party, as you mentioned. It's about principle. And, there have been times in the past where we haven't had organizations that are able to hold our own party or those people who are closely aligned with our principles accountable. But AFP is able to do that, to hold Republicans and Democrats alike accountable, right?
Indeed, and I like the phrase policy champions. It all, to me, it starts with principles, and AFP can find really the candidates who have a foundational principle, because I assure you they don't all. And then principle is great, but to actually have an impact on people's lives and to preserve liberty and property and personal freedom and the pursuit of happiness, ultimately there have to be real world policies that come out of this that can empower people with the gifts of personal freedom and free enterprise. And so AFP just does such a great job at finding, one, who has the principles, who has the policy chops, and then who actually has the legislative acumen. Because let's face it, we got a whole lot more entertainers than legislators today. Entertainment's nice. I like to be entertained, but that doesn't change my life. What changes my life is legislation advancing the cause of freedom and free enterprise.
Well, let's talk about that. Now, while you were in Congress, you were a policy champion, no doubt about that. And that's why you're on the advisory board for AFP now. But while you were in Congress, what was one piece of legislation that maybe you're the most proud of?
I might approach your question this way, since it's still baseball season. It would have been nice to get a few home runs or maybe a triple or two. I'm not sure I can really look back on my career and say that. Hopefully there were a bunch of singles and a few doubles. To be effective in Congress, you got to be selective. I focused on budget issues. I focused on finance issues, kind of the capital of capitalism. And so I thought Dodd-Frank was anathema to the American free enterprise system. And it really worried me that ultimately what we were doing is allowing the government to come in and take over the allocation of capital, to basically politicize the allocation of capital and to allocate it to people who are aligned with the left's political interests. So I set about to basically dissect Dodd-Frank. Didn't quite achieve that. I would say we did manage to at least probably get rid of, well, I'm making up a number, 15 to 20% of it. It was a team effort. It certainly wasn't my effort alone. And I think we we at least help a lot of community financial institutions that are so important to rural America, suburban America. We help them thrive. And because of that, I think a whole lot of small businesses, family businesses, were able to access capital who otherwise couldn't. So, I'm proud of the role I played in that particular legislation. But, if you want to ask me, and it's kind of an odd answer, when I left public office, I had a similar question from my local newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, what I was most proud of. And I said, well, I don't know how much I changed Washington, but at least I know Washington didn't change me. So I guess one of the things I'm most proud of is that I didn't lose sight of my principles. And I tried to be a legislator and actually advance the cause and not make speeches or not make votes, but actually make progress, again, for the cause of freedom.
Well, and that's so true. I think it's one thing that can be said about you is you're the same person you were before you went into Congress as you are today. And, Washington didn't change you. So that's great. And that can't be said about too many members of Congress, I think. Now, on both sides of the aisle, though, today, there seems to be support for growing government. Can you talk about the difference between big government conservatism versus sort of classic liberal conservatism?
Well, yeah, I'm a little concerned. As far as I see it, the left has turned hard left, and now part of the right is turning left as well. And so What I have always seen in my life is that the conservative movement at its foundation, again, was based upon the maximization of individual liberty, of free market capitalism, of a very small, limited government of enumerated powers, and in the strength of civil society over the coercion of government. And so now, unfortunately, what I think I'm seeing are voices in policy following it that says, big government is fine as long as it's used to punish our enemies and reward our friends. Listen, the cultural wars in America are very important. I care passionately about the society that we live in. But we cannot compromise, again, free speech. And so, for example, we have red states and we have legislation in Washington that would essentially tell social media what kind of messages they have to carry. Listen, nobody doubts that conservative voices have been censored by, big social media. But just because somebody's big or somebody's biased doesn't mean they lose their First Amendment rights. And do conservatives really want to be associated with creating a government minister of speech control? No, thank you. I'd rather take my chances with 5, left coast social media CEOs than one government minister of propaganda, if you will. And listen, I don't know our vice presidential candidate. I met him a couple of times. Hopefully I have this wrong, but I saw where apparently he had introduced legislation that would create a massive tax on the endowments that are principally aimed at Ivy League schools. Listen, I wouldn't hire anybody from an Ivy League school. I don't like what they're doing. I don't think they're good for America. But do we really want to, help weaponize the tax code and create these precedents? Because once these precedents are set, they tend to exist forever. And so it makes me question, looking around at, again, this big government conservatism, we talk about, well, let's drain the swamp. Well, do these people really want to drain the swamp, or are they just attempting to train the alligators to bite the right people? No, they're losing their focus. They're losing their focus on limited government and for a party and a movement that created a committee to study the weaponization of the federal government. I just find it so ironic that some on our side are trying to weaponize the federal government as well. You cannot advance the cause of liberty and at the same time sustain the power, the expense, the intrusion of the federal government that we see today. And, we're seeing vestiges of crony capitalism and welfare, this big attack on big business. Big isn't bad, bad is bad. And bad is corporate welfare. Let's not punish big business, but take away, their special benefits, their earmarks, their set-asides. And so, listen, on a lot of different fronts, I do think there is this schism within the conservative movement, but we can't use the tools of the left to impose on society the values that we want. Let's not lose track of what's happening in civil society. Listen, look at what happened to Bud Light. Look at what happened to Target. Look at the announcement of John Deere. Americans are able to vote their values with their cash and credit cards. We don't need government in C-suites and in government boardrooms telling private companies how to run their business. You either believe in free enterprise or you don't. You either believe in limited government or you don't. So, some say it's a debate between, populist conservatives, traditional conservatives, neocons. I don't even know what all those terms mean. To me, it's a fight between those who believe in freedom, free enterprise, free speech, and limited government, and those who once believed in it.
Yeah. Wow.
Otherwise, I have no strong opinions on the subject.
So well put. And, we do see this. So many people, maybe it's out of frustration, right, on the right, that they're being, the government's being weaponized against them, that they want to then turn the tables. I guess that's what it is. But I hope people will go back to their principles.
I don't disagree with that. And I hear quite often, the oft-quoted adage, you got to fight fire with fire. Well, another often quoted adage is two wrongs don't make a right. And again, ultimately, it's not about we will never win by trying to weaponize government on our shift. We have to work to ensure that government has a much smaller footprint in our lives, in our public policy, in our homes, in our schools. And I just think conservatives will rue the day that we try to put government into corporate boardrooms and C-suites.
Yeah. Yeah, we will lose. That's a battle we will lose.
Oh, absolutely. Right? And I didn't even mention the harm to economic growth that would cause.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about regulations. The Biden-Harris administration added 91,000 pages of regulation just in the last year. Talk about why that's so bad for America.
Well, I got to tell you, so I used to be in business. I've been associated with startup companies. And in many respects, it is the regulatory burden that is a higher burden than even the tax burden to entrepreneurship and launching new enterprises. And it is just crushing. And so what this means is you get, big businesses can handle this. Small businesses can't. And for example, I spoke earlier about the Dodd-Frank Act, which was the single largest attack of government on finance, at least in my lifetime, and certainly since the New Deal. And so what we saw was the big banks got bigger and the small banks got fewer. And we had less of a democratization of capital, and the federal government became more entrenched. Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, by the way, one of the smartest guys I've met in finance, I mean, he was quoted as saying, and I think this is pretty close to the exact quote, is that Dodd-Frank creates a regulatory moat. And so big companies can take this regulatory burden, spread it over a larger earning base, and that's why we see more concentrated economic power in fewer institutions. But I would say even more pernicious than the cost and the hassle, it's the control. And it all has to do with the rise of the administrative state. We hear the left so often, oh my God, we got a tax on democracy. Yes, we do have an attack on democracy, and it comes from the erosion of Article 1 of the Constitution. We have unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats making law every single day. I mean, I used to joke. I used to be the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. Most people viewed it as one of the most important committees in Congress. But I had less power than a GS-8 somewhere buried in the bowels of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay, I was accountable to the voters. The bureaucrats aren't. Now, fortunately, thank you, Lord, thank you, Jesus, we had the West Virginia EPA case that the Supreme Court ruled on that will got rid of the Chevron doctrine, which if people aren't familiar with it, it's where administrative agencies got to put their thumb on the scales of justice, and essentially their views of what a law said were given deference, thus Chevron deference. Now, it's been overruled by the Supreme Court. It could be huge, but it's going to take years, and I'm sure the administrative state is going to do everything they can to push back against it. But when you talk about regulations that really, I mean, a regulation is a law. If you don't obey it, they're going to fine you. You don't pay the fine, sooner or later you end up in jail. Right. And so it is really laws that are made by those who are unaccounted, unelectable, and your success in a business enterprise can't depend upon what side of the bed your regulator woke up on or which primary he or she votes in. And so Chevron is important. important. But ultimately, Jeff, what you have to do is you got to crimp the fuel line of big government to these agencies to issue these regulations in the first place, and you got to make Congress accountable. I got to tell you, I was in Congress for 16 years. I can't tell you how often I voted on changing the name of a post office. Don't even get me started. Yet huge regulations that should be voted on Congress aren't. That's got to change.
Yeah. How do we condition Congress to do that? As a former member of Congress yourself, I mean, every other branch of government grabs the authority granted to them under the Constitution, right? The executive branch is certainly very good at expanding their power and grabbing what folks don't take away from them. But Congress seems reluctant to do that. They don't seem to want to go back and grab their Article 1 authority that the Constitution gives them. This overturning of the Chevron doctrine is an opportunity for Congress to do that, but they still have to do it. How do we condition members of Congress to think in this new world with the Chevron doctrine overturned to go back and get some of that Article 1 authority that they have?
Well, ultimately, that's again in the voters' hands, and that's why AFP is so important. As you said earlier, holding our own office holders accountable. This is a huge opportunity. And Jeff, listen, your central point is an important one, and that is Congress has enfeebled itself. It's allowed Article 3 and Article 2 to take away Article 1 power. Let me tell you, if you're trying to be a legislator as opposed to an entertainer, it ain't an easy job. I got to tell you, public policy is hard. And the details really, really matter. And it's so much easier to take, not to take on responsibility and to hold these televised hearings and to bash some government bureaucrat who couldn't do what they did unless you gave them the power in the first place. So again, it makes it a more difficult job. You take on more responsibility, but it's what the founders envisioned. It is foundational to democracy, the protector of our liberties, that Article 1 becomes vibrant yet again. And so, listen, if a candidate or a congressman doesn't want to do the job, I can assure you there's somebody out in America who does. But I would say, one, the voters have to be educated on how little their members of Congress do besides yell at people in hearings, and make speeches on the House floor. I love making speeches on the House floor. I love making votes. But what really counted was making a difference in legislating the protection of freedom and free enterprise.
Wow. Yeah. Let's talk about the fiscal cliff just a little bit. We're headed towards the fiscal cliff. Can you explain to our listeners and our viewers what that means? First of all, the fiscal cliff. And then what are some of the solutions Congress should focus on?
Well, I'm not sure how much time you have for the answer. I don't know who came up with the phrase fiscal cliff, but there are a number of kind of governmental budget phenomena that are all going to occur in 2025. One is, beginning on January 1, we hit yet again another debt ceiling. Now, I can go into all the details. As on a legalistic basis, you hit it January 1. Happy New Year. On a practical basis, you really got till late spring, early summer before you have to deal with the issue. That's probably the most important issue that's involved in this so-called fiscal cliff. The second issue is so many of the provisions of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, really the seminal work of the last administration. Thank you, Donald Trump. Thank you, Mike Pence. Thank you, Paul Ryan. Thank you, Kevin Brady. A lot of the provisions, particularly the individual taxpayer provisions, they expire. Funny how government spending goes on forever and tax relief proves temporary. I got to laugh to keep from crying. So you have a number of those provisions which, in rough numbers, that was tax relief of about $3,000 per American household, and incredibly pro-growth. I mean, That just was a shot of adrenaline to GDP and family income. So a lot of that is on the table in 2025. The government's fiscal year runs from September to September, so there'll be another budget battle. And if it's within, divided government, you could be looking at another government shutdown. You've had these Obamacare COVID plus-ups that Biden-Harris have kept in place. Those are due to expire. So I would say the most important ones are really the expiration of a lot of the tax provisions of the TCJA and facing another debt ceiling. These are huge challenges and, frankly, huge opportunities as well.
Well, Congressman, I just want to thank you again for, first of all, your service to our country, service as a member of Congress, and thanks for your continued service with Americans for Prosperity on our advisory board, and just appreciate all you do. You're a great warrior for freedom and for liberty, so thanks for all you do.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
You bet. Well, thank you, Congressman Hensarling, for joining us. I'll tell you, what a great warrior. We talked about policy champions. We talk about that all the time. Congressman Hensarling talked about how he liked that term, policy champion. He certainly was a policy champion when he was in Congress. And as you can just hear it in him, in the things that he says, it's in his core. Those principles are in his core. I loved how he talked about not selling those principles out. And that there really is a battle for us to remain a party of limited government, and as Republicans, or not just the party, but to be committed to those principles. Whether you're in the Republican Party, Libertarian Party, or whatever party you stand for, we've got to remain with that core set of principles about limited government. So that's important. But listen, thank you for joining us. Stay informed, stay connected. Please connect with us. You can do that by linking or subscribing to our channels on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. It's been great having you with us. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.